In today's video, we're going to step through the process of building exterior lighting for a scene from scratch. This video will be kind of a crash course in all the core components that you would need to create exterior lighting for your scene and still stay performant. So let's go ahead and dive in and get started. So before we get in and actually start lighting our scene, I want to preface just a couple things so you understand the intent of what this video is. What this video isn't is it isn't a massive deep dive into all the different settings and tweaks that we can make to exterior lighting components, be it our post-processing volume, our directional lights, our skylights, any of those different things that we can do. Now, however, I do want to make sure you understand that really the purpose of this is to allow you to be able to take essentially what is a blank scene with no lighting and give it life. So we're going to add a skylight, we're going to add a directional light, we're going to add a few other components that will help us to light the exterior of our scene, and we will cover more in depth on each of the individual components in future videos. Okay, so if you want to follow along with this video, I'll actually pull this up here. So I'm using the Downtown West modular pack that I believe has now been converted over completely free on the Epic Store. So you can grab this, follow along. This is where I'm using all the assets, and we'll go from there. Okay, so before we actually start adding our components, I'm going to cover really what we need to include when I'm calling the core for any kind of exterior lighting. Now, what you're going to need is a post-processing volume, a directional light, a skylight, reflection capture, and exponential height fog. I highly recommend that. And then as an option, we can add in an atmospheric fog for just a little bit more. So, okay, so let's go ahead and dive in now to actually adding the components and lighting our scene from scratch. So again, if you're following along with this video and you've downloaded the Downtown West modular pack, all you need to do is open up the demo environment. That's what we're going to use to start with. Now, you may not have this in your tab, but if you go up to Window and Levels, I'm going to go ahead and show this. The author of this content pack actually was nice enough to include a daytime and a nighttime lighting scene, which we're actually going to toggle off. Now, if you notice you have a lock icon, go ahead and just click it, and all we're going to do is just hide our daytime lighting. And effectively what this is going to do is just going to wipe out any of the lighting components that we don't need, which is perfect. Okay, so if you recall, the first thing that I want to actually add in this is a, let's go ahead and just drop our lights just so we can kind of see what's happening. It is going to look pretty terrible, but that's fine. So we're going to need a directional light. We're going to need a skylight. I'll go ahead and press G and activate game mode. So we'll take these guys, move them up. We're also going to need our post-processing volume. So I'm just going to go over into my place actors and type post-processing volume. So we'll drag this in there. There we go. Don't worry, we'll set up the settings here in a minute. And then the rest, let's actually leave for right now. So I'm not going to add the atmospheric fog. I'm just going to add our primary lights. Okay, so now that I got this added, I'm actually going to first, let's actually just go ahead and group these so they're easy. So I'm going to select all these, click the little plus icon, do dash, environment. That will move it up to the top. And there we go. Okay, so now we can see all of our base components. I'm going to go ahead and go to my directional light, set that to movable, and my skylight to movable as well, so we can just see pure dynamic lighting and not have to view all of the preview shadow indicators. Okay, we'll come back to that here in a second. So the first thing that I want to do, if you know kind of my workflow and how I like approaching things, I've got another couple videos in there to show you how to set up a neutral post-processing volume. Really, the whole idea behind this is that we want to eliminate any kind of it's basically like auto exposure compensation, so the engine will go up, it will go down in exposure by default. Now you can turn it off in your project, which is totally fine. I don't personally like that way because you have to set it each and every time, whereas you can just dynamically control that and override that with your post-processing volume. So that's the first thing that we're going to do. So with my post-processing volume selected, what I'm going to do is actually scroll down in the details panel, and I want to check this infinite extent unbound. So what that means is that even though I've got this square here, I don't have to actually be inside of that volume. This is going to be infinite extent, which means you don't have to do it. So we'll go ahead and check that. And then the next thing that I want to do here is actually go up to my min and my max brightness. Now, if you were going to set up neutral, we could set it to 1, set a max to 1, And there we go. Let's make sure that this is active, infinite extent. Perfect. So now we shouldn't have any kind of ramping up or down of our light. Okay, so let's go back to our post-processing volume. Now, we'll come back to this as we're tweaking our scenes. Actually, no, let's just go and do this now. So, assuming you're doing an exterior shot, if you had your min and max brightness set to 1, it means that all of your light is going to stay consistent. So, for example, if I blow this out really, really bright, you'll notice that my viewport doesn't change with it. Let me show you real quick. Jump back to our post-processing volume. I'll uncheck this. And if you notice, that's that auto exposure compensation happening. So the min and max, if I have it checked to 1, it's fixed. Okay. All this to say, I'm kind of rambling here. What I would personally recommend as a good starting point is somewhere in the value for your min brightness of maybe like 0.3 to 0.5. So I'm actually going to set mine to 0.35, and max brightness, it's up to you. I will explain this in a future video. That actually goes a little bit deeper into the exposure compensation and how you can check that. But for max brightness, 0.6, 0.8, whatever it is. So you can see as I look up, it dims a little bit. As I look down, same thing. So, okay. Of course, it looks like crap. But that's fine. So that should be all we need to set. So again, our post-processing volume, infinite extent unbound. We're going to go back up here as well to our min and max brightness. You can change your speed up and speed down if you want to as well. That is simply just the time it takes for it to go from low to high. So if I look up, 2 seconds. So when it re-exposes, down as well. Okay, perfect. All right, so that covers our post-processing volume. Now let's go ahead and move on to fixing this directional light, which is absolutely terrible. All right, so now that we have our lighting being controlled and at least, somewhat fixed within our post-processing volume, let's go ahead and address what essentially would be your sunlight, which is going to be our directional light. So I'm going to go in here and actually just turn off our skylight, just so it's not affecting anything. If you try to do the hide, it doesn't actually hide it, so you just need to uncheck effects world. Okay, so just going really quickly through our directional light and some of the core components that you need to be aware of when setting up your lighting for exteriors. So your directional light is going to be that omnidirectional, which is essentially like the sun. In this situation, the intensity is set to lux. Now there's a bunch of tables you can look at. Don't worry about that. But the point is you can kind of ramp this up or down. There are some values that I would recommend, especially if you're adhering to like a physical-based rendering pipeline, to look at what would the lux intensity be of a sun, any of your other lights, etc. Again, there's tables out there that you can look up for that information. But in this situation, the intensity is exactly what it sounds like. This is our ability to control how bright or how dim this particular light is. Now I'm going to go ahead and jump ahead real quick before we look at these settings and explain that, again, if you know me and my workflow, this little Show Advanced tab, there's always a bunch of little goodies hidden in there. So I recommend if you ever see it, just go ahead and hit it, pop it, expand it out so we can see what's happening here. I want to say that by default in 423, or maybe it was 424 and above, directional lights by default were coming in with lux, because again, I was trying to adhere to more of the cinematic workflow, etc., etc. So, okay, let's keep rolling on here. So with my directional light, let me go ahead and press G so we can actually see the light. Mobility is the other thing. So if you have static, it's going to be pure baked lighting. Now, typically, if you're developing any kind of game, product, or anything that has moving characters, moving objects, you're going to want to set that to movable and or stationary so you can take advantage of the cast shadows. Now, in this situation, I'm going to keep mine set at movable, which is totally fine. And we'll keep going to there. So again, this is going to cast dynamic shadows for the whole thing. So intensity, I think I'm going to take mine down. I think it was like 60 lux is what it is. With light color, it's exactly what it sounds like. We can change the color. I'm not going to worry about that. Source angle, this actually has to do with the, I'm trying to remember, it's like the degrees of the sun in terms of like the atmospheric scattering. So if you had your source angle set to 0, it's as if there was no atmosphere, no bounce lighting, and it's going to be a really, really harsh sun. If you had that source angle set higher, again, I believe it's in degrees. So again, degrees like you would have for an arc of the Earth, like 10 degrees, I believe. Like 8 to 10 degrees is kind of where you would have like overcast and cloudy. So again, that will actually have some effect when you go to bake your lighting, not so much in movable. So I'm going to leave it at 0.5. It's totally fine for right now. And then temperature is the other thing. So if you wanted to set yours more to like kind of like golden hour, you could take it down. This is in Kelvin. If you wanted it much cooler, you could take it. I'm actually going to leave it at default 6500, which again 6500 Kelvin is kind of default. But again, you can change that all you want. Effects world, cast shadow on by default. Let's go ahead and leave it there. The next thing that I'm actually going to change here is this volumetric scattering intensity. I'm going to go ahead and set this to 4. Now what this is going to do is when you have atmospheric fog and you have the indirect scattering, this light is going to contribute to that, and this essentially is a multiplier of that. So by 1 it's kind of weak, but taken up to 4 we'll see the effect, and you can toggle that back and forth. Okay, let's keep going on here. We're not going to worry about modulated shadows, specular scale, resolution, none of that. We don't need to cover that, but we will kind of just make sure we've got our cast translucent shadows, static shadows, dynamic shadows, effects translucent lighting, cast volumetric shadow. So with all of those turned on by default, we should be fine. Now again, like I said, this isn't a super deep dive. You may find, depending on your platform, so whatever you're producing this for, that you may need to turn off some of these components. So just be aware that's where they're at. Again, they're rolled up by default. Okay, so we'll keep going through here. We don't need to worry about light mask right now because again, if you recall, we have our light set to movable, which means we're not actually going to bake any lighting with it. If we did, we could have some parameters in there as well. Okay, so we are also going to turn on let's see, light shaft bloom. We do want that. I'm not going to worry about light shaft occlusion. Again, that's probably for a deeper topic. Bloom scale, you can set this. When you're looking at the light, I recommend let's just go ahead and set it to like 0.02 is totally fine. Bloom threshold. This has to do with at what point does the bloom turn on. I believe 4. Again, this is probably for a deeper thing. So anyways, we'll just kind of leave that there, not worry about the bloom. Light shafts, again, are going to correlate with our exponential height fog where we can actually have atmospheric. So we'll go ahead and leave that there. Cascade shadow maps. So what the cascade shadow maps are is with our directional light setup movable, we have the ability to cast dynamic shadows through the whole scene. That gets expensive very, very quickly. You could have the most beefy hardware, and that's probably not ideal. Because if we look at our scene, we've got shadows way off in the distance. We probably don't want to be casting our dynamic shadows out that far. So this is where we set that. So what the engine uses is something called cascaded shadow maps. And it's essentially a lower res representation of a shadow that it produces. Now, I'll show you here real quick. So I'm going to go ahead and take my dynamic shadow distance. So you see as I scale this way back, you can see the distance at which the dynamic shadow casts. Now this is from the player's camera. So if I move forward, you'll see that it kind of draws those shadows at a line. But of course, in the distance, it doesn't look great at all. So there are some things that we can actually change to be able to do that. So with our cascade, if I actually set this to 1, you'll see that it starts to take this up. Again, the higher that you set your cascade count, the little bit more expensive that it gets. So for the purposes of this, again, I would recommend if you're producing, say something like a video game or something where you're really hardware constrained, dynamic shadow draw distance anywhere from about 3,500 to about 5,000. As you start pressing past 10,000 units, it can get pretty expensive pretty quickly. So you can change this to whatever you want. If you're working, in a cinematic environment and you really want to push that further, that's fine. Again, you can see at about 10,000 units, it's off in the distance there, and it's pretty hard to see. Yeah, even as I go back, you can see it's pretty difficult to kind of see that transition. So, okay, so we'll leave it at 10,000. The number of dynamic shadow cascades, again, this is what's going to be drawn in the distance. 1 is highly performant. 2 is a little bit more accurate. 3, 4, you can see anything past 3, it's kind of a, I don't want to say a placebo effect because it's not entirely true, but from like 3 to 5, it's more expensive, but you really don't get much visual gain. But of course, from 1 to 3, you can see a big difference. So if you're performance constrained, set the dynamic shadow cascades to 1, 2, or 3. It's up to you. So I'll go ahead and keep this at 3. The distribution exponent, we can kind of leave it there. The transition, don't worry about those. So we don't really need to worry too much about that. Okay, so now that we've got that set up, the other thing that I would recommend is that we have the ability to use our distance field shadows. Now, if you notice that mine is grayed out, which yours will be too, probably, this is a per project setting. So we can go into the project, we can enable our distance field shadows. In fact, we will do that towards the end here and come back to some of these settings just because we need a little bit more in the scene to see what's happening. But just so you know, we'll cover that process a little bit later, but that's why this is grayed out and we don't actually have anything in there. Okay. Thank you, autosave. All right, so I think the rest, really we've only got just a couple other settings. We want to go ahead and check this atmospheric sunlight. If you highlight over, you'll see what this does, but with the new atmospherics, in fact, the setting is in previous versions of the engine. However, it's kind of nested in, I believe, at the very top. So if you're using, like, I think it's 424 or prior to that, you actually see the same setting in your light. So all this is doing is just telling the engine, hey, this is basically going to be a sun, so we want it to go ahead and play into atmospheric. So go ahead and just check that, and that should really be all that we need to do. I'm not going to worry about cast shadows on clouds, atmosphere, or cloud shadows. Again, that has to do specifically with the new sky cloud system, so we're just going to leave atmospheric sunlight. And then I believe that should be all that we need. Okay. Recap. I'll timestamp this so you can come back to it. So we add our directional light into our scene. We're setting it to movable. Intensity, set it to whatever you want. 50 to 60 lux for general sky. Source angle, leave alone. Effects world, cast shadows, again, on by default. Set your volumetric scattering intensity to 4. Go ahead and scroll down. All of the defaults should be totally fine. We don't need to worry about anything inside of here. Again, if that's hidden, it's just a little roll up. So if we go back up to my light, little roll up, pop that down. We can see everything that's in there. We'll keep going down. We're going to set our light shaft. So light shaft bloom scale threshold. Again, you'll see that more in the final. Tweak it to your heart's desire. That's totally fine. Dynamic shadow draw distance on removable light. Again, I would recommend if you're on a really budget constraint platform, anywhere from about 2,500 to 3,500. If you've got a little bit more beefy hardware, go ahead and start pushing that out to about 10,000. Anything above 10,000 is going to be a little hard to see in the distance, so we'll keep that at there. And we'll leave everything else as default. For our far shadow cascade, you can leave it at, I believe, yeah, we'll go and just set it to 1 so we have it. And we're also going to check our atmospheric sunlight so it plays with our atmosphere. And that should be it. Okay, that covers the directional light. Let's go ahead and move on to the skylight. All right, so the next thing that we're going to cover is our skylight. Now, hopefully this will be a little bit faster than the previous information that we covered with the directional light, because we're actually going to see a lot of the same settings, or at least very similar settings in our skylight versus our directional light. So I'm going to go ahead and let's hide our directional light. You can see we have nothing that's black. And with my skylight, I'm going to go ahead and set effects world. Now, if you notice, nothing happened. Even if I take my intensity scale up to 5,000, nothing happens. The reason for that is actually this first setting that we're going to cover, which is our source type. So with my skylight set to movable, again, I'm going to be casting real-time shadows for this demo. You can set it to stationary if you want it to bake with your lighting as well, but for this we're going to keep it at movable. And again, we'll find out a little bit later too why that's important with our distance field ambient occlusion. Okay, so with my source type set to SLS captured scene, this is actually a question that came up on a previous video about, okay, well, if it captures my scene, doesn't it save it? Well, technically it does, but anytime you go to bake your lighting or you change your lighting, with SLS captured scene on it, it will actually recompute the scene. So say, for example, you go into your scene, it looks beautiful, it's awesome, you have your skylight, it's all set up, and you change, you know, say for example, one little light or some actors in there that changes the scene dynamically. Again, when you open it, when you run your bake, it's going to recapture that. So for the most part, you can use it. It's safe. There's really nothing necessarily negative with it. However, we have a second type, which is this specified cube map. So I'm going to go ahead and change this. I'm going to go into my HDR map as well, and I'm actually going to just use this one that I downloaded from HDRI Haven, which is this tank farm. So I'm going to go ahead and drag this into my cube map. So if you notice, now I have light. Okay, let's jump through and kind of see the settings that we have available to us. First thing is the cube map angle. So if you see here, it's probably better if I had some kind of reflective surface. You can see as I move this, it's actually rotating the HDR in my scene. Now there is another way that we can actually do this, but for the purposes of this demo, we're not going to do the HDRI projected into the world. We're simply going to use it for our light. Okay, so that's our source cube map angle. The next thing is going to be our cube map resolution. So again, kind of going up to this reflective surface. This one actually is taken in at 2K. Now in this case, it's actually down rested a little bit. I can force it. In fact, if I do, I think 2048, it should here recompute. Okay, I realized I had that off screen so you couldn't see it. So what I did is actually went in, double-clicked the HDRI from the content browser, and with this little roll-up, you can actually set the maximum texture size. So you can see that if I had this off, it actually sets it, I think, at like 512, it clamps it. So by setting my maximum texture size, I'm actually forcing the engine to go ahead and use bigger resolution. So I'll go ahead and save that, come back in here, and if you notice too, it's still kind of blurry. I can set that cube map resolution, so if I go here, say like 256, 512, 1024, you notice it kind of starts to get placebo effect but by bumping this up from the default of 128, I can get a little bit better reflection in there. So we'll go ahead and set it to 512, which is fine, and that will be good. Okay, so the sky distance threshold, you just leave it at default. That's totally fine. Intensity scale, it's exactly what it sounds like. This is just a multiplier. I hate this. Don't try to drag it because it's very, very sensitive. But of course, with 1, you can see that's intensity. If I take this down to like say 0.25, which again depends on your HDRI source. I can say that the process, and I'm going blank on his name, the guy, I apologize if you're watching this, dude, my bad. But the guy that actually authors a lot of the HDRIs from HDRI Haven, he actually goes through a balancing process, so most of those are pretty consistent. So I find intensity scale of 0.25 to 0.5 is pretty accurate in Unreal, again, using that cube map. But there's really no exact science of what your intensity scale needs to be. Just look at your light around and determine, hey, if it's too bright, take it down. If it's too dark, take it up. So I'm gonna go and set this to 0.25. Again, this is kind of be our ambient light. Light color, so this is actually just an ability to kind of override the color. Use with caution, please. Effects world, cast shadows. Again, all that's gonna be in there with our movable. Let's keep going down. We're gonna leave these set as is. The reason being is for volumetric scattering intensity on a skylight, that's a mouthful. You got to be very careful with that because that can quickly blow out some of your looks. So we'll just leave it at 1, and that's totally fine. Okay, so the next thing that I do want to show here, so I'm kind of go in this section, it'll be easier to see. By default, again, this is in this roll up here, so if you don't see it, go back up to your light and go ahead and just check this. By default, what happens is that your skylight, if you think about it like a sphere, everything below the half of that sphere by default is a solid color. So if I uncheck this, I'm actually going to inherit. So if I open up my HDRI, so if you drew a line across the very middle of this image, by having the lower hemisphere solid color, everything below that line would be black. So if you uncheck it, you actually get all the color information from that cube map. So to show you, I can set this. So if I go, something purple, you can see that everything cast down, so kind of in this section here, is from the HDRI. Everything from below is color. So that's absolutely terrible. But because I'm using the cube map, let's go ahead and uncheck this. Cast static shadows, dynamic shadows, volumetric shadows. Again, totally fine by default. Again, depending on the platform that you're developing for, you may want to go and turn some of these off. But it's totally fine. We're going to leave these as default for now. And then finally, we'll leave visible, actor hidden in game. I don't know why that's on by default. So we'll uncheck that, leave visible. That's totally fine. So should be good. And then I believe this is again new in 426, I believe, with the new atmospherics. This cloud ambient occlusion, you can turn it on. Again, we'll cover that in a much deeper video where we go into this, but for purposes of just setting up your scene, don't worry about it. You can check it on, leave it, that's fine, totally good. Okay, and that should be it. So again, this is using our cube map as opposed to our specified scene. If you wanted to use your captured scene, again, set up all your other lights, set up all your components in it, change it, add your skylight, and then all you have to do is actually scroll down. There's this recapture, click recapture, it'll do it. So, okay. So, in summary, we're going to set it to movable. We're going to use a specified cube map, which is the one that we want to use. Set our cube map angle. Again, if you want to kind of align where that's being projected, resolution. Again, all that's going to matter is if you are overriding the cube map. Otherwise, go ahead and just use your specified, your captured scene, and you don't have to worry about any of these guys. Intensity scale. Again, set it to what you would like. Expand this out. Uncheck your lower hemisphere as solid color if you're using an HDRI. If you want to keep it on and just kind of, change it yourself, totally fine. You can keep that on there as well. All of our shadow parameters on by default. Uncheck actor hidden in game and set to visible. And then that should be it. Again, we're going to come back to this. There's another component here where we can actually adjust our distance field ambient occlusion with our skylight. But for now, this is just our basic process. So, okay, so that sets up our skylight. I'll go ahead and turn on our directional light so we can see everything kind of working together. That's horrible, so let's go for directional light. We'll go ahead and just take this down a little bit more. So we'll take it to like 10, no, 7, 3. There we go. Okay, so that's our basic scene. Again, still kind of coming together, and we'll see as we pull in some of the atmospherics how it will look a lot better. So that covers up our skylight. Let's go ahead and keep moving on. So before we begin going to our atmospheric fog, I do want to add one more component to our scene that will help out. So I'm going to actually go into our place actors. I'm going to just type in sphere and grab this sphere reflection capture. So I'll go ahead and drag this in. And if you notice that it did change some things. So in particular, I will cover sphere reflection captures in a future video. Really all we're doing with this particular reflection capture is simply helping all of our reflective surfaces. So for example, like our water, our windows here. So in fact, let me go ahead and just use this puddle right here. If I delete that reflection capture, you'll notice that things kind of look a little off. So I'm simply just going to drag a reflection capture in. Position does matter, but in this situation, I'm just going to move it up a little high. Go ahead and set my influence radius all the way up. Captured scene is totally fine. Leave my brightness at 1. If you find that it's a little too bright, go ahead and take this down to like say 0.5. You can actually see here what's happening. Default at 1, captured scene is totally fine. Again, really all this is for is just our initial setup on any of our reflective surfaces, just being able to see more kind of accurate lighting in the way that's happening. So, okay, that covers reflection capture. In fact, I'm gonna go ahead and let's just move this up to our environment. So he's all the way up there, perfect. Okay, so the next thing that I wanna do, which is really gonna help this scene. Now, by default, this looks pretty terrible. And a big part of that is because we have this black background. So what I wanna do is actually go over here, which sphere. I'll go ahead and clear this so you see. I'm just going to type in atmosphere, and I'm going to drag this atmospheric fog in. So go ahead and put this in, and we'll leave this here. Actually, you know what? No, I jumped ahead here. We're actually going to add in our exponential height fog. So this is going to be our much nicer one. So you can see instantly our scene already starts to have a lot more life to this. So let's go ahead and cover the settings that we want to change in this one. So let's go ahead and move this to our environment. So that should be totally fine. And then let's go ahead and start going through the settings. Okay. So I'm gonna go ahead and just press G to go into game mode just so I can see my scene a little bit better. And let's step through what we have here. So static, stationary, movable. Go ahead and just set it to static, that's fine. Technically, if I need to double check this, but we're not going to be moving it in game, so let's just save a little bit of performance cost. Uncheck movable, just keep it as static. Okay, fog density is exactly what it sounds like. This happens to be the amount of density in the fog. So you can see dragging it, going from 0 to 0.05 is really not a big jump, but it does make quite a difference in our scene. So that's one thing that we'll start with. I'm going to show you something here too. So if I set my fog density fairly high, and I move this, this may be a little difficult to see. Let me kind of zoom back. But your exponential height fog does matter its height position in the world. So you can see as I raise it up, it actually gets a little bit more dense near the bottom, so where the actual height fog is. And if I bring it down, it's a little bit different. We can override parameters, but just be aware again that the position of your height fog does matter. So go ahead and press G, go back into game mode again so I can see what's happening here. Now, fog height fall off is exactly what it sounds like. So what I was just showing you there is a way that we can essentially compress or decompress that height fall off. So if I kind of look up, you can see that if I change the height fog fall off to really, really low, it's essentially going to have that fog from the ground going up pretty high. Now if I take it up even further, so say for example I go from 2 to say, yeah, I don't think it'll let me go above 2, that's actually going to compress it even further. Okay. The next thing actually is this secondary fog data. Now this allows us to essentially layer a little bit more fog on top. So if I change this density, change this guy back up, and you can see here too, it essentially follows the same logic. Now if I have my fog density and the height fall off set to the same, in fact let's go to 1 so it's super dense. So you can see here, it's essentially just layering exactly on top of where my existing fog is. But if I take this height offset, I can actually move that further. So for example, if I take it, I think 10,000 units, I believe it's actually going to take it down versus if I do, say for example, we'll go negative 10,000, it's actually going to move that into position as well. So secondary fog data, again, is just a way that you can kind of layer a little bit of extra detail with your fog. So we'll go and just reset all these back to defaults, not use it at all, and that's totally fine. Okay, our fog in scattering color is exactly what it sounds like it has to be with the scene. So you can see that if you had like a desert scene where there's a lot of like dust particulate from around you, you can do that. By default, it's kind of a bluish tint for the sky. You can reset the color. It's totally up to you. Our artistic preference. Fog's max opacity is exactly what it sounds like. As you start to go down further, essentially what this is going to do is the layered kind of stacking effect of your exponential high fog, you're kind of setting how far that goes. So you may find with this one that by reducing it, that you can actually help a little bit with performance as well. Start distance is exactly what it sounds like. So as I push this out, it's the distance at which the fog starts. As you can see, as I move forward, the fog kind of stays, again, about 2,000 units out in front of me. So artistic preference, set it to whatever you'd like. And then cutoff distance is actually the distance, again, at which the fog is cut off. That's really a performance thing that you'll probably want to use. Default, leave it at 0. Okay, so we'll go through here a little bit more. I don't believe there's really any other settings that we need to be concerned with. Directional light scattering intensity. Again, you can kind of go in here and change. This has to do with your sky. So you can see as I kind of move this, this is that kind of the distance-based one, but I'm going to go ahead and leave this as is, which is totally fine. Volumetric fog. This is a way to instantly get beautiful fog. So with volumetric, it's actually going to do layered volume. But again, be very careful with this one because if you are on a very limited, constrained platform, so you don't have a lot of hardware performance, this can get expensive very, very quickly. So we'll leave that there. The scattering distribution actually has to do with how the volumetrics are factored in. 0.2 is fine. You may want to bump that up to 0.5 if you find that looking at your directional light, it's a little off. Albedo, emissive, exactly what it sounds like. The extinction scale actually has to do with the amount of bloom. Now I don't have, yeah, you can see it there a little bit. So if I take this extinction scale way up, you can see that I get those just amazing God rays. But we're going to go ahead and leave this down because that's just a little too much. But that is a way that you can control that as well. View distance, scattering, again, all the same here. We'll leave the rest as default. So leaving our volumetric scattering on is fine. Fog density is probably a little much. So I'm going to tip mine to about 0.02. We'll do that. And then start distance, probably push that out a little bit. We'll go about 8,500. That's fine. So we got just a little bit of fog in here. Scattering distribution. Actually, we'll take this down to 0. Let's go ahead and bump this up a little bit more. And so now we have some atmospherics in our scene. Okay, so that covers our fog, adding it to our scene. The next thing that I want to do is actually jump to help us give us a little bit of background. So we'll go ahead and use we'll add in a BP Skysphere. So, okay, let's keep moving on. So the next thing that I want to do is actually add a backdrop to our scene, because right now we still have kind of this black voidless sky, which is kind of breaking the look of our scene a little bit. So there are a few ways that we can do this. We can use an HDRI backdrop. Again, I believe that's 424 or 425. No, I think it's 424. Plus, you have that ability. You have to go into your plugins, enable it. But for this one, I'm going to use the tested and true, which is BP Skysphere. So I'm just going to type sky, drag our BP Skysphere into the world. Let's go ahead and move this up to our environment as well. So we have this, and all this is going to do is just kind of add a nice little backdrop for me. So with my Skysphere, really all I want to do is actually link our directional light to the Skysphere, so the colors, which you can see here, will be determined by the sun position, which is our directional light. So I can do it a couple ways. If I press G to go back into game mode, so we can see here, there's our Skysphere. I can click this little pick actor from scene. You kind of have to get right on. So there's our directional light. Click that. Or you can just simply select the drop down, and you can see there's our directional light as well. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and go up and just show you kind of what's happening here. So with my Skysphere, if I take my directional light, in fact, let's go ahead and just, we'll just move this guy up so we can see what's happening here. As I move my light, so say for example, I go to something a little more sunset-ish, and I move it this way. What I did is actually disabled snapping. So you can see that my skylight is going to be very low on the horizon. Go back to my Skysphere, refresh the material, and so you can see now the sun is kind of it's redid the colors. Again, let me make sure that I preface this one. There is a much better, much more beautiful way to do this with the new atmospherics and the sky in Unreal. That will be covered in a future video. Really, the purposes of this one, again, is the idea of what would you need as a base scene for just about any platform, be it VR, consoles that are very hardware constrained. This is a way to start that. So again, just completely just a way to start from scratch. So you can see if I move this, go back to our Skysphere again, refresh material, auto update, refresh material. There you can see that the sun position here still aligns with this. So, okay, I'm gonna go back down. Actually, let's go ahead and just move our skylight back down as well. So we have that. There we go, perfect. Okay, go back to this mode, kind of set it up a little bit, take our Skysphere, refresh the material. Okay, so the rest of this I'm going to leave as default. Again, there's a much better way that we can do this now. This is fine. It's totally fine for what it is, and we're using our directional light to cast it, and that's fine. It gives me a backdrop and all that. What I may want to do is actually bump up our cloud opacity a little bit. So let me go ahead and set this to 1.5. So again, we've got some clouds, which look pretty good. The clouds are moving. There we go, perfect. So, okay, so our scene is actually starting to come together. Now, this is still terrible. It's not bad, but it's still terrible. But that basically gives us all of our components that we need in our scene. So with that, really what I'm going to do is step through the next process, which is balancing everything that we have. Now, before I do that, let's go ahead and enable our distance field ambient occlusion. So what I'm going to do is go up to Edit, Project Settings, and in our project settings, you can go to All Settings and just type in Distance. If we scroll down, we should see Generate Mesh Distance Fields. So we'll click this. You can turn these on. I'm not going to turn these on right now, but compressing mesh distance field and 8-bit mesh distance field again applies to platforms where things are going to be heavily limited, but we're going to go ahead and just keep those off for right now. And I believe that's all that we need. Now, on mine, it's actually off screen, so you can't see it, but it does say restart required to apply new settings. Go ahead and restart, and that's it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep this same kind of layout here. Let's go ahead and just restart the editor, and we'll actually see distance fields kind of taking place and what's involved with that. So we'll go ahead and restart, and we'll be right back. So now that we're back in our scene, the editor's restarted and has generated our mesh distance field. the scene does look a lot different, and I think a lot better at this point. So to show you kind of what's happening here with our distance fields, I'm going to go under Show, Visualize, and I'm going to check this distance field ambient occlusion. So here you can see what is happening under the hood, what Unreal Engine is processing with our mesh distance field. So it essentially looks like ambient occlusion, distance field ambient occlusion, DFAO, as you probably heard it. And that's exactly what it's doing. It's another layer of depth to our scene that helps to bring that realism just a little bit further. Now, again, you may find, again, it depends on the platform in which you're producing for. This may be too expensive. I can tell you, though, that distance field ambient occlusion works for just about every platform, minus the ones that are really hardware constrained. Things like the Nintendo Switch, mobile devices, you probably don't want to use this. So, okay. So with our distance field ambient occlusion turned on, we're actually going to go back to some of the settings we had before and show you where we can control how this is viewed in our scene. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually go to our directional light. Now you can go into search details and just type in distance, and there we can see distance shadow for our cascade, distance field shadows. We can click this, which again, this will help to control, which we didn't have before, the distance at which those shadows will be turned on. Now you're probably not going to notice too much with by default, so if I crank this down, again, it may not be readily visible. You can leave those as default, that's totally fine. Distance shadow movable light, I believe, yeah, this one by default is fine. You can see it does have, actually no, ignore that because that's our cascade maps. So ignore me on that one. Okay, so that's the first place that we can control is our directional light. Really the powerhouse when it comes to our distance field ambient occlusion is in our skylight. I believe if I turn off static, you'll see we don't get anything stationary. Doesn't actually give us our distance field ambient occlusion, but as soon as you go to movable, that's when you're able to inherit those abilities. So again, I'm going to toggle between stationary and movable, so you can see the difference that happens here. So let's go ahead and change it to movable, and I'll show you exactly what we can change. So if I go down all the way here to distance field ambient occlusion, this is where we can change the parameters, how it affects our world. Occlusion max distance at 1,000. Again, I want to say that this has to do not necessarily at the draw distance, but the distance at which, I'll highlight over this, yeah, one point will affect another. So essentially what it's saying here is, you know, if we take, for example, this little cart that we have and the tree, and let's say that they are exactly 1,000 units apart. Let me go back to my skylight and scroll down here. This occlusion max distance, so again, if these guys are 1,000 units apart, when I have the occlusion max distance set to 1,000, they will affect each other. If I take this down to say 500, they will no longer affect one another. In fact, we can probably see this more exemplified with the tree affecting the building. So as I take this up, you'll see that we get that shadow distance. So again, that's all that this does, is it's the distance at which objects affect one another. So change it to whatever you want with your scene. In this situation, I'm fine setting it to 1500 because I do like the tree affecting the building. Okay. Occlusion, contrast, and exponent are exactly kind of what they sound like. So with your exponent, it's basically like a contrast, or I should say it's kind of like a curve in which you can increase it. That's a horrible explanation. And then with the contrast, that's more or less what it sounds like. So brightness, darkness. The other thing that I would recommend changing, though, with your distance field ambient occlusion, by default, it actually comes in at pure black. So you can see all our values are black. If you know anything about physically based rendering, true saturated colors, so pure colors, i.e., 100% red, green, blue, white, black, any color that's 100% starts to kind of break what naturally happens, because in the real world we don't really have super perfectly saturated colors. So my recommendation here is, because this color is in linear space, I would recommend a value of 0.18, which I think is going to give you your 50% gray. So if we have that, I believe 0.09. Anything slightly lower than pure black, you can see actually helps to make it look a little more realistic. So you can play with this value. Again, I threw kind of a ballpark number out there, but you can see as I change this, in fact, we can actually tint our distance to ambient occlusion, which is kind of cool. But again, I would recommend having a pretty low value, but definitely not pure black. So it may be easier just to take the slider and change that there. So, okay. So we will keep that. And that is pretty much it with our scene. This next process, I'm actually going to do just a quick time lapse. I'll come back and summarize. But essentially, now that we have all of our components in our scene, now we get to have fun playing and start tweaking and changing our scene the way that we want. So again, I'm going to time lapse this portion, but what you'll see me do is actually the methodology that I like doing when it comes to lighting, which is what I call an isolation approach. So I'll go in, I'll actually hide like a directional light, just adjust my, adjust only my skylight, for example, turn that off, go back to my directional light, turn it on, change that. So you'll see me turn things on and off, and really all I'm doing in that process is isolating that so I can see exactly what it's doing, tweak it, and then at the end bring everything together and balance it. So I will go ahead and just let this time-lapse roll, probably have some fancy music playing in the background so it's not so boring. And what I'm going to do is just bring the scene into balance so I can make it look pretty exactly what I want. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Sit back and enjoy. Okay, so I would call the scene good enough for now. I'll let you be the judge. I think it works fairly good. So I'll kind of fly you around here, show you kind of the pretty atmospherics. We'll kind of move around. So we've got the bright patio area, and then we go into here in the dark. We can still see that we can see some things. Again, if this is too dark, I can adjust it in my post-processing volume. But in general, I would say that this scene actually doesn't look too bad. Again, just for a exterior, we can absolutely keep pushing this even further, but you know, relatively quickly, I mean, minus my rambling of how to set the stuff up, I mean, you could throw together a scene like this in a matter of, 5-10 minutes at most. So, okay, let me go ahead and just step through real quick and talk about what things I changed above the defaults that we made, again, to give me this artistic choice. So, if you watch the time lapse, the first thing that I did was actually establish my directional light. So I'm going to go ahead and uncheck my skylight. I did duplicate this. In fact, actually this one where we use the HDRI, I've unchecked that. I'll come back to that here in a second. So I'm just going to show my directional light. So if you know my methodology and the way I like to light, the way anybody lights is I wanted to create I wanted to draw the viewer's attention in the eye, so all I did is I simply just kind of moved the light into position where I had some nice shadows and, casting light on this building, shadowed in this one, so I've got that scene contrast. So I simply just rotated it, moved it a little bit to establish my light. And the next process I just took my intensity down because, again, it was a little too bright for my taste. And I used a temperature override because I wanted it to be a little bit more golden. Again, there's multiple ways you can control this, but I kind of wanted a warm looking sun, and I did that. The next setting that I changed, and again this was a little bit later, was my volumetric scattering intensity. So if I'm looking through the trees, you can see that I get a lot more of those God rays. Again, if this was set to, I think we had it at 4, it was just a little weak, so I punched it up to 10. You could go up however high, don't go crazy. I bumped that up, and I believe that was pretty much it. Yeah, I left everything else the same on there. So that was my directional light. The next process that I did, so if I go back to my captured scene and turn on effects, so again, this is with it baked. I didn't like what the HDRI was doing for me. So if I take off the captured scene, this may break it, and turn on our HDRI, this wasn't bad. It didn't look terrible, but when I combined it with my directional light, I just wasn't getting the effect that I wanted. Now, the first thing that I did is I actually went in, if you notice here, in fact, I covered this in a previous video, I'll show you real quick though. Go to your view options in your content browser, show engine content, click your engine content and just search for SM_color calibrator, which is what here, drag it into your scene. This is what I was using for mine. So if I go over to here, in particular, I'm looking at this chrome ball. So I rotated the cube map, you can kind of see here, to get it in position. So you can see there's my skylight, the HDRI where the sun matched up. And I use that, so technically the HDRI is trying to project from the same distance. It doesn't look bad, but again, it wasn't quite exactly what I wanted, so I broke my rule of saying, you know, normally use the SSL specified cube map, and I changed it to captured scene. So I'm gonna go and just uncheck this effects world, go to captured scene, turn this on, turn this on, and now this is a little bit different. So going back to a previous thing that I said is that whenever you add your skylight at the start and you really don't have any lighting or anything going on the scene, it's really not going to capture anything. So that's why adding it towards the end or changing it to captured scene does make a difference, because I had the light on and everything. So what I changed in this one is I simply just set my light color. So I actually tinted it a little bit more. So you can see here kind of what it's doing. I wanted something that was a little bit cooler. You know, you can change it whatever, it's fine. And then I believe, yeah, so I did change the lower hemisphere is a solid color. The reason for that with the captured scene, if we go down, you can see that it's just simply capturing white. So there's really no information there. So by checking it, you can kind of see the effect, in particular under here. And I simply tinted it more of a brown color, because if I look on the ground here, there's a lot more brown in my scene. So that was pretty much it. That's all I changed on my actual skylight based off of the previous one. And then finally, the last thing that it is, I just went into my exponential height fog and just changed some of the settings to push the atmosphere in, take it down a little bit, change the color, and that was pretty much it. I don't think I changed. Oh yes, I did change this. So with our volumetric fog, I had the scattering distribution set to 0, which you can see if I go through, you still get something, but I went ahead and just took this up to 0.9, just so it gave me a little bit more atmospherics, which again you can kind of see here as well. Does play into that part. And that's it. So again, to kind of recap what this video covers, this is not a all-inclusive, cover every single setting that you can change. Really, this is more designed to give you a small tool set to create exterior lighting for your scene at just a quick start. Now, again, you can spend days, months perfecting this lighting, making it look great, adding different things. But really, this setup here is designed more to allow you to have exterior lighting for just about any platform. And again, that's coming from experience, having developed for consoles that are heavily limited. This does work. Granted, there are some things you'd want to turn off for things like the Switch, but I digress. So this at least gives you everything that you need to set up an exterior scene from scratch, quickly, get you up and going, be able to see everything, and start playing around. So as always, I hope this helps out. Please keep the comments coming. That helps me know where you guys are struggling with game development, in particular with Unreal Engine, and what I can do. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Again, I will say that there are other videos coming down the pipe eventually to cover a lot more in detail, a lot of these settings and what to do. So stay tuned. Again, thanks for watching. Catch you in the next one.